Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Let's continue now with the last part of the chapter, chapter 7. This part is about how a cell acquires energy and how plants produce energy from photosynthesis and how they get the energy from those sources. Plants are obviously exceptional in their ability to produce sugars or energy from photosynthesis. The organ of photosynthesis, or I should say the organelle of photosynthesis, is the chloroplast. The chloroplast is a cellular organelle. It's like a part of the plant cell. And very curiously, chloroplast has not just one set of membrane, it has two sets of membranes. This is a very curious, interesting fact, which inshallah we'll talk about sometime in the future. So a chloroplast has two membranes. Why? Because it is that cool. It has to have an outer membrane and an inner membrane. So a chloroplast has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And stacked there are these like penny-like things. These are called thylakoids. They're connected to each other like this. They're thylakoids. And if the whole stack is called a granum, the granaries that store grains or salt or whatever. The whole stack is called the granum, and each individual of these pennies type things, pancake type things, are thylakoids. So thylakoids are those individual sacs, and the whole column of thylakoids is called a granum. So that's where the photosynthesis occurs. The inside part of the chloroplast is the stroma. It's like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast, so to speak. So the key features of the chloroplast are the two membranes, the outer membrane and the inner membrane. These thylakoids, which when they stacked up, are called the granum. Now, the inside of the thylakoids is called the lumen, or inside of things in general is called the lumen. So here's another picture of the same. You should be able to articulate basically what photosynthesis is. If somebody asks you, oh, so what's photosynthesis? You should be able to say what it is. Photosynthesis is a process where plants take ambient carbon dioxide from the air, and water from the ground, and carbon dioxide and air, and then with the help of sunlight, source of energy, are able to transform the carbon dioxide and water into sugar molecule or glucose molecules into sugar. Okay, that's what photosynthesis is. So it's a process where plants take carbon dioxide and water, and from light energy are able to produce carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are a stored form of energy. And oxygen is in fact a byproduct of this reaction. So this you should know. How can you not go through biology and not be able to describe photosynthesis, right? So that's what photosynthesis is. The process is quite complex, and inshallah we'll study it more in the future. And this is what's happening on the thylakoid membrane. See, all these little molecules that capture energy from sunlight, which is represented here by this yellow thingy that kind of lands on there. So that's happening on the thylakoid membrane in the chloroplast. So, as I said, we'll have an opportunity to study this in detail in the future. But this is what's happening in the chloroplast. The light energy strikes these thylakoids, and the chlorophyll, the molecule chlorophyll which captures the light, is on the membrane of the thylakoid. And along with water and carbon dioxide, it produces energy. The energy molecules. So the captured energy from light is stored in molecules. This is like the cash energy, so to speak. And these are the names of the energy. It's like ATP is like the dollar bill, the energy dollar bill of a cell. NADPH2 is another like $5 bill, so to speak. So the energy that's captured from the sunlight is stored in these molecules. And that energy then is taken into a different biochemical processes called a Calvin cycle, with the result of producing sugar. ultimate energy comes from the sunlight and stored in the bonds, in the energy bonds of a sugar molecule. So that's what photosynthesis is in a brief description. This is a plant and all the cells. And look, you notice the rigid cell wall given the very definitive geometric shapes. And all those little green things are chloroplasts, because that's what they do. Plants like to do photosynthesis. So this is an electron micrograph of a chloroplast. Again, you can see how beautiful it is. So one key difference, as we have already pointed out, is that plant cells have chloroplast, obviously, and animal cells don't. If you had chloroplast, you'd be green, and you might even have leaves, but you don't, see, because you don't do photosynthesis. Now, when plants capture that energy, they store it, see? They store it in the form of glucose. So glucose is like stored form of energy. It's like the candy bar. So because plants, they just don't make all the energy and then they use it all up, because they need to save some of it in a storage form, like in the fridge for the winter and etc. So the stored form of energy is the sugar, the glucose. When they need to release that energy again for their use, they break down that glucose, that they eat that candy, so to speak. And this breaking down of the glucose occurs in the mitochondria. And the mitochondria, therefore, is the place where the stored form of energy in the form of glucose is then converted into usable form of energy, the ATPs, etc., which are like the dollar bills of the cells. And mitochondria, curiously, has very similar structure. It also has two layers of membranes, the inner mitochondrial membrane and the outer mitochondrial membrane. So, because why? Mitochondria, just like the chloroplasts, are too cool to just have one layer of membrane. They must have two layers of membranes. But structurally, otherwise, they don't have thylakoids, obviously, because mitochondria are not doing photosynthesis. They have this convoluted, membrane in the membrane where all of the breaking down of the glucose molecules occurs. And this is an electron micrograph of a mitochondria. Here's another detailed representation of the mitochondria. Look how different mitochondria. There's no thylakoids in the mitochondria. The other very curious thing about mitochondria is that they have their own DNA. Their DNA is circular DNA, just like bacteria. So, which is led some people to theorize that mitochondria are primitive bacteria that were eaten up by cells. Maybe that's why they have two membranes. One, their original membrane, and then one membrane as they were being eaten up. They just captured some of the membranes of the host cell. But anyways, mitochondria have their own circular DNA that's distinct from the rest of the cell's DNA, which is a very interesting fact. And in fact, they have their own ribosomes too. Almost as if they were own individual little tiny cell within the cell, the little big cell. So that's the mitochondria. They have a circular DNA and their own ribosomes. So mitochondria take the energy from various different things, protein, sugar, and fat, mostly sugars and fat, and with the help of oxygen, which is why you and I breathe, because we need oxygen to get the energy from these molecules, and we produce energy out of that. So that's what mitochondria do. So here's the relationship between the chloroplast and the mitochondria. Chloroplasts capture the sun's energy, and they produce molecules that store that energy, and that energy is stored in sugar molecules, carbohydrates. Mitochondria take those carbohydrates, and when they need to, they break them down to produce usable form of energy in the form of ATP. So these are reverse processes. They make glucose, mitochondria breaks glucose, makes glucose, breaks glucose. These are complementary processes. All right. This is the last part of this chapter, and it's about cytoskeleton. Now, the cell, the mushy part of the cell, is not just plasma fluid, see? it has a skeleton. It's like a highway. It's like Spider-Man was there, type of thing. And this is very quite exquisite. So how does something move from one end of a cell to another end of a cell? How does that happen? That happens because there's these highways of cytoskeleton, these kind of like threads that go across the cell, and things kind of move along on these highways. This is a electron. This is a micrograph of just highlighting the cytoskeleton, and this highway system inside the cell is called the cytoskeleton skeleton of the cell. There are basically three forms of highways. Okay, it depends. Like the little side street. Okay, that's these are the little tiny side street. There's the microtubules. Okay, and there's actin filaments. You like to think so. There are three types of streets: medium streets, large streets, and so on and so forth. They're called intermediate filaments, microtubules, a little bigger, and actin filaments. They are found in different locations of the cells. For example, this one looks like intestinal type of cells, etc. They're mostly over here, whereas the microtubules are over here, and intermediate filaments are over here. Okay, they're like threads of proteins that run around and act as highways inside of a cell. And here's how they look. The actin filament, okay, looks like this. It's like two beads of strands of beads twirled around each other. Okay, they're smaller than the microtubules. You can see they're much bigger, a third of the size. And this is the intermediate filament between. So these are the three major types of filaments that comprise the cytoskeleton. Now observe how these kind of form the pathway. So something that needs to get around from the mitochondria, say, to over here or from over there, they go through these kind of like, just like Spider-Man would go across using the threads around. Okay. They also make up like the tails of bacteria or the sperm flagellum, these microtubules. The same structures that make up the cytoskeleton also make the tails of bacteria and the sperm, and they propel the bacteria or the sperm, like over here, like you see. So this flagellum is just a structure made of these filaments. And some bacteria have several of them, these flagella, and these cilia also are composed of filaments. So that's it. That concludes chapter 7. That's the basics of some of the cellular structures. Inshallah, next time we'll talk about chapter 8. Until then, as-salatu wa-salamu ala rasulillah, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.